I've got a question for you. Who likes math? I got two hands. All right. I wasn't expecting any hands, so that's already, all right. Got to change my whole approach now. Okay, well, how about this? Who likes talking about relationships? There we go. Now that I've lost everybody. I guess Gail shot his hand up. Well, Ecclesiastes chapter 4 is a hard one to go through because it's about math and it's about relationships. It might be still like, what? That seems kind of weird. I didn't think the Bible had a lot to say about math, maybe about relationships, but how do math and relationships come together here? And it's a hard chapter to go through, and I guess partially because as a male of the species, I am genetically predisposed to not want to talk about relationships. And as a pastor and theologian, I am not an accountant. And talking about math as well is not something that is a strong suit. I was always good at math, but that's why I am not the treasurer of the church, nor will I ever be an accountant or a treasurer. That's my wife. And so it's kind of a double whammy in terms of a difficulty to talk about. How do we get to this, and how do we deal with this? And so we're going to look at chapter 4 here and see what it has to say with this math of relationships, and these relationships in a fallen kind of world that we are in as well. And last time we looked at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it's a real high note. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is, God is in control of everything, and he's working everything together for his good and into this great and perfect and beautiful thing that he's building, with everything having its time and its season, and this wonderful working out of God's plan in the world. And chapter 4 kind of picks up that idea, and he moves kind of taking that through as he sees some examples of that, and kind of takes it and looks at some dark stuff, but also kind of takes it to a very practical application. He's going to take these ideas and work with them almost throughout the rest of the book. But in chapter 4, he takes that into our lives that we live, again focusing under the sun. This is under the sun here, the world that we live in, but also our lives that we live under the sun and how we relate to other people. And so it seems a little bit negative, but we're going to work it out here. And again, that phrase under the sun, a lot of the negative stuff is when he's focused under the sun in just this world that we live in down here. Sometimes things don't make sense, and sometimes things are hard. And he's going to kind of look at that and deal with it and kind of give us some wisdom to live in this world. The wisdom that the Bible offers isn't necessarily the wisdom that we always want to have. We want someone to kind of always be there to say, it's all good, don't worry about it. And the biblical wisdom is there to put its arm around us and say, you know what, it might not always be good. But it's okay, because there's God, and there's more. But we have to talk about some stuff. And I talked about that before with one of the other chapters, that Ecclesiastes is kind of the we need to talk of the Bible. And if you are married, if your spouse says to you, we need to talk, it's usually going to be, it's always uncomfortable, and you never look forward to it. And so Ecclesiastes is kind of that. It's the we need to talk. And it has to talk to us about some stuff that it's real, and there is good, but it's a little uncomfortable sometimes. But I hope that as we look at this, we won't be uncomfortable, but we'll see what he has to give us here as you focus on relationships and with some math. And so if you would join me as we read chapter 4 in your bulletin or in your Bible, if you would, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, starting in verse 1, we read, "Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been, and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw all the toil and all the skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 handfuls of toil and striving after wind. Again, I saw under the sun one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil. His eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is a vanity and an unhappy business. two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm. And how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end to all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. And so as we look at this, it is kind of a chapter that it's difficult to put a structure on, because it almost at times seems like Solomon, the preacher, is going into Solomon proverb giver mode as he kind of drops in some proverbs and he goes into this and he goes into this. But it might be difficult to see it at first glance, but there is an overrunning current through this. If we look at these things, we see there's a current of relationships here. He's talking, every single one of these little scenarios and these little proverb things he drops, it has to do with relationships. He's talking about how we relate to one another. Not marriage relationships so much as just the fundamental relationships that we as humans have with other humans under the sun. You live in this world, you have relationships with somebody under the sun. We live in a world with other people. And he follows this mathematical pattern. Like I said, there's math here. And I apologize, there's math. He goes from, it's 0, and then 1, and 2, and 3, up to even thousands. We see that the oppressed has no one. And that because the oppressed has no one, it would be better that he was never even born. So 0. Right? Not only does the oppressed have no one, it would be better if he wasn't even born, so that not even 1, but 0. And then we see the person who is working for no one, the one who has no one in his life but himself. We have 1 as the loneliest number, the one who is working and toiling for no one but himself. And then we are told of 2 being together, and how in 2 there's great reward. And even 3, it says, even bringing in 3 into the equation, that not only 2, but even 3 would even be better, as we have this threefold cord that is not quickly broken. And then it kind of goes into this parable of sorts, where we're told about a young and an old king, one wise, one foolish, one poor. And this young king who rises up from being a poor in this rags to riches story, and has, as we're told here in this little parable, all those under the sun who cannot be counted following him, but yet even in that state they don't remember him and they fall away. And so we have up to millions of people, thousands of people. So we have from the 0 to the 1 to the 2 and 3 to millions. And it's all following a thread of relationships and how they relate to each other. We are made for community and fellowship. We as human beings are made for community, fellowship. And life under the sun, this life that we live under the sun, is easier and has meaning when we're living for and with others in relationship. And even though relationships are broken by sin, they are still a good gift from God that he has given us, that we have this ability and this thing within us to relate to one another. And so as we go into this, we see as this opens up, we have the one who is alone and oppressed, the one who is the 0 here, who they have no one, and it would be better if they were no one, the 0. And he is kind of picks this up. It seems kind of dire. He's talking about oppressions that are done under the sun and all this talk here. And he's kind of picking up an idea that he started in chapter 3:16 when he was talking about everything under the sun having its time and its place and the perfect pattern that God is working. And in chapter 3:16, he talked about under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. So he kind of presented this idea that in the place of righteousness, there was wickedness. In chapter 3:16, telling us in chapter 3, concluding, well, in verse 17, that God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time for every matter and for every work. So it kind of gives us some comfort there by saying, yes, there's wickedness in the place of righteousness and injustice there, but God will judge it all. And he kind of revisits that here by saying, yeah, but, God will judge it. But man, how sorry for those people who are oppressed, because they have no one to comfort them. We're told twice, he repeats the same thing. No one hears them. They have no one to comfort them. They are alone. And in their loneliness, he laments over this. He says that something that strikes the modern hearer, and especially churchgoers, as something ungodly to say. I mean, why would you say this? That's not right. You shouldn't say that. That's not a good and godly thing to say. He says, well, these oppressed people with no one to hear them, they'd be better off dead? Well, that kind of hits us, kind of slaps us in the face there. Better off dead. And, well, hey, what's more, better off to never even been born. That seems awful harsh, preacher of Ecclesiastes. That seems awful harsh, Solomon, right? Better off dead. Well, he's lamenting this fact. He's already addressed the fact that every injustice will be met, but he's looking at this and this is an expression of his sorrow over this. This is truly a pitiable and sorrowful place to be. And he's not alone in this. And I looked at this, mentioned these few verses back a few chapters when he said that he hated his life. And even here it is more appropriate. In Job chapter 3, verses 3 through 4, Job says of his own self, says, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness, may God above not seek it, and light shine upon it. Chapter 11, verse 11 of that same chapter, why did I not die at birth and come out from the womb and expire? Verse 16 of that same chapter, Job chapter 3, why was I not hidden as a stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? It would be better, Job is saying, it would be better for me if either I died in birth, or if I never even was born, if I was just stillborn. I never saw this world. This is his lament because of the pain of life. And Solomon, the preacher here, is in that same place. He sees the wickedness of this, and he sees the aloneness of those who are alone. And he says they are alone and they have nobody. And because they have no one, it would be better for them if they just weren't even here to see and to feel the pain of being alone. Jeremiah 20, verse 14 through 18, he does the same thing here upon seeing the persecution and the wickedness of the world. He says, cursed be the day on which I was born, the day when my mother bore me. Let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought news to my father and said, a son is born to you, making him very glad. Let that man be at the cities that the Lord overthrew without pity. Let him hear the cry in the morning, an alarm at noon, because he did not kill me in the womb. The man who told my father, it's a boy, he should have just killed me. That's what Jeremiah is saying. He should just kill me because what I've seen in my life is too painful. And he says as well there, as he wraps up in verse 18, why did I come out of the womb and see toil and sorrow? This echoes with Ecclesiastes. Why did I see these things and spend my days in shame? This is the mourning of a heart who sees something so sad and so sorrowful that he can't comprehend it. Now, we in our day and age, we tend not to go to this extreme with our emotions. We tend to be more reserved, especially as men. We get ourselves together. We don't cry. We don't get that upset. But Solomon, and in his day and age, he sees the pain of people who have no one, who are oppressed and have no one. And he sees their loneliness and the zero of their life and says it would be better to not be alive than to have one, to have just you by yourself with no one to comfort you. He's overwhelmed with this emotion. And so he takes this idea and he says, yeah, it would be better to not be alive. And it's right, because we were not made to be alone. Even going all the way back to the perfection of the garden, in a place untouched by sin, not like this world that we live in under the sun, but even in that perfect place, even in that perfection of creation in the garden, God looked upon Adam and he said, it is not good that man should be alone. So even there in the perfection, untouched by sin and pain and sorrow, even in perfection, it is not good to be alone. How much more so, essentially, what Solomon is pointing to here, in the world where there's oppression and pain and sorrow, to be alone and to have no one to comfort you. is literally the worst place you could be. Because it's not good for us to be alone. We were not made to be alone. And so what do we do with that? We need to remember the oppressed and those who suffer. We need to remember that we not be in a place where there's no one to comfort them. No one that you know or see in the world should ever feel that there's no one to comfort them. We need to be the first one to jump in there and be the one who comforts them. James 1:27 tells us that the pure and undefiled religion that we are called to is to visit the widows and the orphans and the afflicted, to visit them in their affliction. James 1:27 tells us that this is the duty that we have before God, to not leave them alone with no one to comfort them, but to go and to be there. So that it wouldn't be that one would be better off to be zero, but that one would not be one, but would be many as people come and comfort them. And there are people who are alone, and we are called to be there. God is a God who is the father to the fatherless and the one who comforts. The Holy Spirit, we're told, Jesus calls him the Comforter. We are comforted with the Holy Spirit, and we have been called to comfort those who need it, to comfort them. Solomon moves on with this math of relationships from the zero there, the one who has no one who would be better to be a zero, and talks then about the one who is one, an island unto himself, one. And Solomon continues this math, and he uses this one, and he says that this too is broken and sorrowful, though not as much. And he continues by telling us he sees, and under the sun we have this, he is observing what he has seen under the sun, and he says, I see under the sun. And what do I see? He sees that the main motivation for everything that people do is envy. Right? It's all about keeping up with the Joneses. That this is the mindset of under the sun living, that you are working, if you are by yourself and you are alone, that if you are doing this, that one of the main motivations for everything that happens is to have more or better than our neighbors. Now, on some level, that's very true. I mean, we want to have at least as much. We know we want our house to be, when people come over, we want it to be, okay, or we want them, we want to not have things be run down and shabby. We want, when people even come into our church, we want it to be nice and clean and look nice and sharp. I know I put on clothes so that, I'm obviously put on clothes, but I put on clothes to try to look sharp and nice. I make sure my hair looks nice. I want to look nice. But why? Because I want to impress people. We want to make people think of us nicely. We want, it is in a sense almost envy of others. We want people to look upon us and think nicely of us. We want people to say, whoa, those guys. But he also points out that this constant drive to impress and to do more leads to a solitary life, because one works to set themselves apart. You're doing all this stuff to set yourself apart from everybody else, and you end up alone, and you have no one. And that this toil that alienates and isolates us does nothing. No matter what the material gain is, you end up in this place where you're just by yourself, and then what's the end? He just kind of tells us, well, you're all by yourself, you're doing all this work. You have this man who has nothing, he even goes on to tell us about. And he even slips in to the Solomon, writer of Proverbs, by telling us of the one who, on the other hand, folds his hand and eats his own flesh. This is very, very Proverbs language here. The one who just sits back, folds his arms, or folds his hands, and consumes his own flesh. Well, I don't know anybody who eats themselves. So, Solomon, you're being a little dramatic here. And he is being a little dramatic here. This is all about making a point. And his point here is the same point he makes in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 10 through 11, also repeated in the verbatim in Proverbs 24, 33 through 34. He says there, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. And he tells us in Proverbs, it reminded me as well as Proverbs 26:15, which has a similar picture of the sluggard buries his hand in the dish, and it wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. That he puts his hand, we go down to a potluck, and you put your hand out there to scoop out the food, and you just were too lazy to pull it back out again. This is a silly picture, but this is what he's saying. The fool and the sluggard is like this. And so there's two extremes. The one who's working so hard trying to chase after the Joneses because of envy of everybody else, and on the other hand, the guy who is so lazy he just consumes himself with his own laziness and self-destruction. He says neither one of these is good, he says, because this is solitude. And it is being alone. It is all by yourself. And he contrasts these two and even tells us it's better to have a balanced approach here. It's better to have a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after wind. It's better, you don't want to have no hands full and be the guy who just has his hands folded and is consuming himself. But you don't want to be the guy who's striving after everything and I've got 2 hands full of toil. Because that's striving after wind. But better have 1 handful. And you can rest with the other hand. You can have 1 handful and the other hand not. It's okay. Balance is the way to go here. Because we don't want to end up in a place where he tells us that he sees under the vanity, in the vanity under the sun, one person who has nobody, yet toils and toils and toils here. We're sure the one who is working and working and working and has nothing. He works and works and works and what does he have to show for it? We're told here in verses 7 and 8 here, the one who works but has nothing, whose eyes are not satisfied with riches, but is not working for anybody. He's only doing it for himself, and in the end, that is nothing. Because he's doing it all for what? For what purpose? He's climbed the corporate ladder, and he's gotten to the top. He's gotten all the land. He's gotten all the stuff. He's made it to the top of it all. But he's got nothing. He's alone. He's got nobody. He's got nothing. 1 Timothy 6 through 7, one of my favorite verses, says that godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. And so we're told here, yes, you could be the guy who's striving and has everything and climbs up to the top of it all and is the top of everything, but then what? If you are alone, it means nothing. Because we were not meant to be alone. So the one who is alone in pain and suffering, who has no one to comfort them, woe be to that person, because they'd be better off dead. But also, woe be the one who has everything, but still is alone. Because it's not good to be alone, he says. You should not be alone, because you might be in this situation. Yes, that is bad, and it is sad to be alone and oppressed and in pain. But it's just as much emptiness and vanity to be alone and have everything. It's just as much emptiness. One is truly the loneliest number. And he says this is not only is this emptiness and vanity, but he adds this is unhappy. This is an unhappy business to be alone. It is unhappy business to be alone. And so he comes into that, well, if 0 and 1 don't work and not what we're called for, then what are we called to do? Where should we go from here? And he kind of comes into this with almost this unexpected joy into the scenario that's been really dire and bleak, as he tends to do. He comes in, verses 9 through 12, telling us that 2 are better than 1, that 3 are even better than 2. And he even answers part of his question. This is the first time we see a gain for the toil. This whole book opened with a question, a quest for meaning. What gain is there to be had for all the toil that I do in this life? For all the stuff I do in this life? For my life? What is the point of it all? And here we have the first bit of hint that there's something here. Because he tells us here that there is something to be gained. There is here, with 2, there is good reward for toil. This is the first time we're told that there is something gained from toil. And it is not found with the getting of stuff or the doing of stuff. It's not found in that, but it's found with the fact that you are not alone, that you have 2. That companionship, that fellowship, that not being alone, that is the reward for toil. What is the point of life? Well, part of the point of life is to not be alone. If you want to have meaning in your life, don't be alone, because alone, he just talked to us about 2 different pieces of people who are alone, the one who has nothing but pain and oppression, and the one who has everything, both alone, is both emptiness. Now here, the one who's not alone has great reward. He has something. And not only is this reward in this life, it's good reward. Working for oneself or keeping up with the Joneses, this is all nothing. But working for others, with others, this is gain. And this puts the work in a different category, because now no longer is work and toil things that I do to get stuff, to define who I am and define meaning. Now I'm working and I'm doing stuff for other people. I'm working out of selflessness. I'm working to support people. I'm working to get some, not meaning of my life, but for somebody else. I know when I was alone and before I met my wife and stuff, I'd work and work and work, and I'd do all these things, and it was whatever. And it was lonely, and it was oppressive, and it was dark. But once I had somebody else to work for, especially once I had kids and stuff, once I had someone else to work for, when it didn't matter, because I had something else in my life. So it didn't matter, because my work wasn't my whole life. I had something else to be gained. And so we have this ability to comfort each other. We give meaning to each other as we join in fellowship and companionship with each other. And he spells it out even further with us by telling us examples of rewards here that, yeah, if you fall down, you got someone to pick you back up. If you are cold, you have someone to keep you warm. Right? Not just talking about marital stuff. This very quickly goes into marital stuff. This is just about general companionship and fellowship of other people. That if you have someone with you and you fall down, they can help you up. That if you have someone with you, you have someone to help you stay warm. That if you have someone with you, and he even throws in a third person here, that if you're alone on the road, you might be beaten up or someone might rob you and stuff, but if you got someone else with you, you probably won't be. Not to mention, if there's 3 people there, that won't be broken. No one's going to come against you if you're 3. And so we're told that we're given this example here that this is this companionship, this fellowship that we have, which again goes back to the garden again. We were not made to be alone. Adam had God, and he walked and talked with him. Yet even in that, God said it was not good to be alone. The blessings of companionship are truly wonderful. One of God's great gifts to us is this ability to have fellowship. He gives us people in our lives. One of God's great gifts is this. It helps us to deal with the problems of oppression and poverty and loneliness and injustice. We have this in the company of other people. And so he gives us this fellowship for each other. That we have this ability to be with each other. And that there's great gain in this in life, to be with other people. And we say, well, so what? Now what? Well, the math checks out. We're meant for fellowship and companionship. So seek others, seek fellowship, seek companionship. I mean, it can start with something as easy as don't be a jerk. I've had to been told that many times in my life. My wife chuckled a little too loud on that one. Right? Don't be abrasive. Right? Be nice. Seek other people. Seek people who might be lonely so that you can join with them so that when they fall, you can be there for them. And that when you fall, they can be there for you. Seek fellowship. Seek companionship. Because the math checks out. 2 is where it's at. 3 is where it's at. Companionship, fellowship, not being alone. And he goes on to tell us in this little proverb here, as he talks to us about popularity as the chapter wraps up here, he tells us this kind of almost Jesus-like parable of a man. And I say Jesus-like because it's kind of complicated and kind of almost doesn't make sense unless you read it like 10 times. And it's like, oh, okay, I see what's being said. Not that it took me more than 10 times, but Solomon here is telling us that I'll give you the paraphrase because it works a little bit easier this way. There's a king who has forgotten how to be wise and take advice. There's a young man who is born poor who ends up in prison, yet through wisdom goes from prison and eventually takes the throne. The foolish king before him ends up in prison. And his wisdom and his rags to riches story, perhaps, he brings him to the throne, and he has a throng that has no end, we're told here. That it's all the people under the sun. There's no end to the people who follow him. But yet, even in that, a later group comes up after them, and they don't rejoice in him at all. They don't remember him. And so he has it all. He has the throng and the popularity, and it just goes as quickly as it came. Popularity comes, popularity goes. The old king was certainly popular at some point until his foolishness took it away from him. And the young man ends up in the same boat as him, all alone, with nothing. Popularity is not the answer to the loneliness and emptiness of our life. We need to seek out true and deep and lasting fellowship. I know when I was in high school, one of the most popular people in school committed suicide. Like the most popular kid in school committed suicide. And in his suicide note, he said, I am surrounded by people who don't know me. I am alone, and I have no one. But from the outside, he had everybody. I was literally alone in my life, and I said, this is insane. But he was this young king who got a big following around him and all this stuff, but it didn't mean anything because it was just shallow. It was superficial. It meant nothing. And so seeking popularity like this and getting a whole bunch of people isn't the answer either. It's to really get the deep relationship, to have the relationship with other people, that we can build a life together, that we can find meaning, that we can have this threefold strong cord that can't be broken with each other. This is what we're called to. And so what was our takeaways here? Well, being alone is miserable. I shouldn't have to tell you that, but being alone is miserable. Big news flash there. I've been there. I said, when I was in high school, I had nobody. Before I met Elizabeth, I had nobody. There was several years in my life where I had nobody. But the only human contact I had was at the drive-thru window or the checkout at the grocery store. It was literally the only human contact I had. I worked third shift security by myself, going into a place. I literally had no contact with any other human being for like 3 years. That's loneliness, and it's miserable. But it's part of the fallenness of the world, because we were not created to be that. We were created for fellowship. We were created to have more, to have fellowship and family and community, and we're all part of what God intended. And know that if you are in God and if you have God, that you are never alone. Jesus knew solitude. It was a very real part of the suffering he endured for us. Upon that day, in that dark day, his disciples ran from him. He was alone. The darkness overtook the earth so that he was not even under the sun, because the sun forsook to shine. The sun went to darkness. All this talk about under the sun. Jesus, for a moment there upon that cross, was so alone that he was even removed from the world of under the sun in a very real way. He was truly alone as he suffered in our sin. And part of that suffering was that aloneness. Aloneness is miserable, and he suffered for that. And he suffered through that. As the Father forsook him and his disciples forsook him and flew far from him, and the whole world turned against him with mocking and jeering, and he was separated from Father and from brother. And so as Jesus was on that cross, he bore that pain of the loneliness and the pain of our sin so that we would never have to be alone. So we would never have to be alone. I don't have to be alone because I have Christ. You, if you have Christ, are not alone, and you never have to be alone. He bore on that cross the truest and most deep loneliness imaginable, as he bore the pain for our sin, so that you would never, ever be alone. And he bore that pain for us to bring us into community, not just so that we would never have to be alone, but to bring us to a place where we had 2, 3, and even more, to bring us into community and fellowship. We were not made to be alone, and he bore that ultimate loneliness so that we could have the truest restoration of fellowship in all of creation, a restoration and a fellowship not just with our Creator, but that we would not know him as God, but that we would be adopted as sons and daughters of God, that we would, even more than that we would be called into a body, a family of brothers and sisters, united by his blood that was spilt for us, a body with Christ as its head. We are brothers and sisters because of what he did. We have a fellowship here. We're called to this fellowship because this is better than anything the world has to offer, because here we are united. Here we have fellowship. We are more than brothers and sisters because we're called to be joints and ligaments, bones and muscles, part of a body, parts of a body clinging together with Jesus as our head and his blood flowing into the tissue, bringing life into it itself. This is what we are as a church. This is what we are called to be in the fellowship of the saints, a body united, his blood flowing, bringing life, fellowship. We're not alone. We have him. We have each other. We've been called to something. There's no such thing as an isolated Christian. Sure, we may be alone for a time. I was alone for some time. But in the end, we are beckoned and we are called to be a part of something that in the end brings meaning and substance to our life, that in great gain is made in the fellowship that we share. And we may face pain and difficulty in this life, but we are not alone. We have each other, a family, and a body that is stronger than any threefold cord. That's what draws us together. This is why the author of Hebrews in chapter 10, verse 25, encourages us to not neglect the gathering together, and he doesn't do so offering some obscure theological reason or some legalistic reason of why you've got to come. He says, no, don't forsake coming together, because when you come together, you encourage each other in the fellowship of the saints. Because when you gather, when you do this thing, when you are the body of Christ, you encourage each other and you strengthen each other. Even more, he adds, as we see that last day drawing near. I'm not a doomsayer about when the day is coming, but I can tell you right now that that day is certainly a lot closer now than it was when Hebrews was written 2,000 years ago. And so we're called to the fellowship. Don't be alone. Don't be alone in your pain. Don't be alone in your success. Be part of something. Find meaning. Dig deep. Join the fellowship. Seek companionship in Christ and in each other here. Join me as we pray.